Hello, I'm David Mark, a senior editor at the Washington Examiner. I'm privileged today to host this inaugural webinar about character assassination in American politics. It's a collaboration between the Examiner and the Character Assassination and Reputation Politics Research Lab, or CARP, as I'll refer to it. I am author of the 2006 book, Going Dirty, The Art of Negative Campaigning, which has been updated in subsequent election cycles. Sharing their expertise today are Eric Sharev of George Mason University, a political psychologist and CARP co-founder, and Jenny Cohane, assistant professor of communications at the University of Baltimore and also a CARP co-founder, and Hugo Gurdon, editor-in-chief of the Washington Examiner. This is the first in a three-part webinar series on character assassination and the American presidency in advance of the November 3rd election, pitting President Donald Trump against Joe Biden, the Democratic nominee. I'm looking forward to all of us adding historical context to what is already a bitter fight, one in which we've seen President Trump question the mental acuity of his opponent, former Vice President Biden, and Biden, in contrast, in a virtual meeting recently with Democratic convention delegates, effectively saying Trump wasn't smart enough to confront the coronavirus pandemic. I think that's just a sample of what we're going to see through the fall campaign, so it will be fascinating to start. So with that, let's get started. Eric, could you please define character assassination in politics and how it differs from tough but within bounds in traditional negative campaigning?
David, character assassination is, in fact, an attack on someone's reputation. But reputation doesn't belong to us. It is in the eyes, in the hearts, and perception of others. So essentially, this is an attack on how people perceive the person who is under attack. His or her reputation, credibility, we talk about. And it's not necessarily about just attacking person. We can talk about someone's policy, his or her attitudes or actions, political actions, or something the person has done. But character attacks about things irrelevant probably to action. It's about the persona. It's about the credibility. It's about many other factors, just simple things, complex things, complicated things, in very simple terms. As a politician, one can say, I bring you justice and peace. And a character attacker will say, okay, what have you done? What did you do on Friday last night? So in the park, right? So it's about something else. It's about something which may characterize a person's individual features that then they attach to the personality. And there could be cheap shots and smears and labels, could be just exaggerations and smirks, and usually just exaggerations about being a hypocrite, about being a liar, inconsistent, flip-flopper, typical in politics. Could be direct falsification, just direct lies about someone's character.
Okay. As you noted, character assassination, the notion of it goes back to the nation's founding and even before. And you've written about George Washington, of all people, who we think of as paragon of virtue, the general of the Continental Army being targeted back in 1776 during the Revolutionary War. Explain how George Washington was effectively the first victim of character assassination in American politics.
Well, currently we are working on a database of character attacks just throughout history, but the case of George Washington, I would say it's a top 5, I guess, most classical case. Essentially, well, he wasn't president yet, but he was elected commander-in-chief of a Continental Army. And so apparently in London, somebody very clever and with a good English published fake letters allegedly attributed to George Washington with its many intimate details and facts and just names. He written those letters allegedly to his close friends and family members. In those letters, he appeared as a neurotic, as inconsistent, crybaby, who was apologeting, in fact, just really liked the English king, the person who he admired allegedly. So it was inconsistent, person, not commander-in-chief of the army. And they've been published again in New York and many pamphlets in the East Coast here in the United States. Washington ignored them. Washington dismissed them. He wasn't affected by them, apparently. And yet, I think that they were sold pretty well. There were so many people willing to get this and read this. And who knows, maybe some of them began to doubt the reputation of a commander-in-chief. They couldn't defeat Washington on the battlefield. Well, there was an attempt somehow to smear him and, well, diminish his power through the spurious fake letters.
And that was not the end of it with these charges and countercharges for George Washington. This came up again when he was actually president of the United States, the first president, 20 years later. Explain how it came to be at that point and how it fits into what was becoming more of a partisan political environment, even though Washington himself had warned about that.
Well, the cases of character attacks are often timeless. We call them zombie types because they've been revived and go on and on. 20 years later, somebody, hopefully not original authors, we don't know, they're just authorship of those letters, but somebody just revived those publications, suggesting that, well, during the political battle for Jay Treaty, essentially peace treaty between US and Britain, Washington was too pro-Anglophile type of a person. The critics of this treaty believed that there was special motives behind Washington's support of this treaty. Something sinister, something really ridiculous, and yet there was mentioned. So those letters were used again for political purpose, probably by other people to achieve particular goal, just defeat the treaty in US Congress.
And of course, that was a sensitive charge at the time to say that you sided with one country or another. Thomas Jefferson was accused of being too close to France, John Adams too close to Great Britain. This is the time when the US was still, in many ways, trying to establish its credibility as an independent country abroad. So that was a very sensitive charge to make at that point.
Oh, it was. And Washington, 20 years later, after the first letters were published, was really emotionally hurt. And he even asked his close associates to write rebuttals and letters in which they would suggest clearly that the letters were fake and Washington had nothing to do with those letters, as he was emotionally hurt. And he wrote about this, how deeply he was affected by those fakes. But there was quite direct attack at George Washington's character.
Is this something that continued on immediately after George Washington's presidency, or was there a break of several decades, or did this pretty much set the standard for character assassination in American politics? And what were the early decades of the Republic like with character assassination?
Well, David, those letters probably was classical case, one of the most studied, I believe, that's by us. But I'll just read you just very quickly, just year 1800. Just among hundreds of words used by Adams and Jefferson against each other. A quote, a fool, a criminal, an atheist, an anarchist, a liar, a coward, a hypocrite. Well, against each other, their teams, they're both electorate teams. Just those smears against those founding fathers was pretty normal. Just year 1800. Since then, it was relentless, was constant. Character attacks part of political process. Not only U.S. democracy, but we believe it's just quite universal to democratic process to use any possible impossible methods just to somehow diminish the power of the opponent.
And my understanding is a lot of those charges came in partisan newspapers, where we think of the news today trying to be impartial down the middle. That's a whole separate discussion, but assuming that's the objective, was this meant to change minds or kind of preach to the convinced and sort of aimed at getting them out to vote, and something that we discussed 200 plus years later?
David, you research this subject. Essentially, we're talking about 5, 6, maximum 10% of people who are the most gullible, the less knowledgeable, most vulnerable, most unsure in both camps. But character attacks, not only do they destroy someone's reputation, but also they mobilize the base. So some people definitely will vote for candidate A, and just regardless of attacks to hear, listen to, or exposed to about their candidates. But still, it gives some people more mental ammunition. Yes, so just as we attack the opposition and we smear them, they deserve that. So we'll be more inspired to vote, support my candidate. Or maybe some people who are undecided, they, again, those 3, 4, 5%, crucial. In our elections, this is crucial. Those individuals would either stay at home, just having doubts about their choice, or just maybe go and vote for somebody they didn't have intention to vote 5 days ago before that tax. So this is, again, we work very, very narrow margins, but this could be very effective. 3, 4, 5%, this is what the battle.
And just very, very quickly, it sounds like even though we're 220 years later, technology has advanced exponentially in ways that founders would never even imagine. We can do this on YouTube, we can do this on Twitter all day long. The basic themes there are the same of trying to go after somebody's character, and that's the name of the game.
Well, indeed, there are certain universal features. We find them in the Roman Empire, we find them in the Roman Republic, we find the Middle Ages, and we find it 1800, 1700, 1800, 1900 politics in the US. But there are culture-specific and technology-specific features, which definitely are a characteristic of today's moment. So there are universal features, and there are definitely specific, typical for today.
All right, thank you very much. Eric and I were just discussing character assassination in the early decades of the Republic. Let's fast forward almost 200 years or so to what was really a seminal event in character assassination, negative politics, whatever frame one would like to put on that. This was the Gary Hart scandal in 1987. He was effectively the leading Democratic presidential candidate at the time. I wonder if you could describe quickly the details of that episode and how you see it fit into the long history of character assassination.
Absolutely. The Gary Hart case is really important for understanding our more modern senses of character assassination, but I want us to understand it both as a turning point, but also as a continuation of the ancient practices that Eric talked about. But what happens with Gary Hart is that character assassination really goes mainstream, and the attacks on Hart are disseminated by the mainstream media. Previously, as Eric mentioned, attacks had been circulating in partisan newspapers, but again, it's mainstream here. And the personal lives of politicians as the subject of character attacks really come to the fore here. Now, of course, political reporters had covered the personal lives of politicians before, but they hadn't really gone digging for the details of those controversies. Think, for example, about Ted Kennedy's 1969 Chappaquiddick issue when he drove the car off the bridge, killing Mary Jo Kopechne, right? Obviously, that becomes sort of a discussion about Kennedy's judgment and character, but nobody in the press really went digging for that story. It sort of fell into their laps. Same thing with the Thomas Eagleton case in 1972, when he was very briefly George McGovern's VP pick. It emerged that he had undergone shock therapy for depression. And so again, his stamina, his judgment, his character were all called into question. But nobody was really hunting super deeply behind the scenes for these details. Instead, they sort of emerged organically. And so now we have the mainstream media in the Gary Hart case really seeking these details and widely and quickly disseminating them. So let me tell you a little bit more about what actually happened in the Gary Hart case, and we can tease out some more important themes. As you mentioned, David, Gary Hart was the frontrunner for the Democratic nomination for president. He had previously served as a senator from Colorado from 1975 to 1987. He had sort of an open secret reputation among Washingtonians for being a little bit of a womanizer, although that wasn't uncommon, right? Think about JFK. But the political press wasn't really in the habit of covering that type of stuff. Now, when asked about it, Hart would say it wasn't anybody's business, or he would deny it. So in 1987, the Miami Herald gets an anonymous tip saying that they can actually prove that Hart is having an extramarital affair, and gives details about how to track down Hart and find the woman. Tom Fiedler's the journalist that answers the phone and goes through this sort of soul searching about, is it important for the public to know that Hart is having an affair? And he ultimately decides that if it's true, the public should know, because it's part and parcel of Hart's character, and character is important when you're running for the highest office in the land. So the Miami Herald ends up staking out his townhouse in DC, finding evidence, catching him with another woman. They confront him, he denies it, they run the story. It's the stuff of movies. Actually, they did make a movie about this starring Hugh Jackman. Mm-hmm. But the story ends up blowing up, and the reaction isn't kind. But it's not kind toward the Miami Herald, suggesting that they were the people who had overstepped and that they were setting a really dangerous precedent for political journalism. At this point, however, Hart's reputation and character is seen to be in a free fall. He holds this last-ditch effort press conference trying to rescue his reputation. And when asked point blank whether he'd ever been unfaithful, we get maybe the most famous line of this entire fiasco, which is, "I don't have to answer that." Mm-hmm. Shortly thereafter, we know the National Enquirer gets this photo of Hart with Donna Rice sitting in his lap and the yacht monkey business, and it confirms the whole thing. Hart obviously suspends his campaign, never ends up getting to be president. But it foments a real reckoning in the press. Did the Miami Herald overstep? And is it really important to understand the character of politicians through the foibles of their personal lives? And I think regardless of where you come down personally on that issue, the Miami Herald won the day, right? This becomes the norm for political journalism, that, you know, the trials and tribulations of personal lives of politicians really do give us insight into their character. And as a voting public in a democracy, that's important for us to know. And I think we really see, as I mentioned, the link between personal lives and character, and not just pointing to issues of candidates' policies. I also think, for what it's worth, that the fact that Hart so kind of staunchly denied it and lied about it made everything worse for him. But so to kind of pull our threads together here, David, Hart is very much caught in the crosswinds of a changing political environment. But I also think we can see the attacks on his personal character and judgment as part of this long tradition of character attacks in the American Republic that Eric talked about.
Now, that episode came at a time, 1987, where dominant media was still effectively major newspapers, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. You could have a regional newspaper that would break a story, like the Miami Herald, and the three major news networks. You had CNN, but it hadn't really established itself. How did this portend what we would see today in what is a totally different kind of news environment, where there's really no news cycle anymore? It's all the time. Did this usher it in? Did it take a while for this kind of to take hold, or was there an immediate effect where this, fair or not, good or bad, this became fair game?
That's a great question, David. If linking personal lives and character in politicians is one of the key things that happens with Gary Hart, the importance of the changing media environment, I think, is the second big thing that's important for us to take away. There are lots of media-based changes that are happening as Gary Hart is fumbling through this episode. Firstly, I would say that the rules of political journalism are changing, and this is partly a result of Watergate. Matt Bay talks about this a lot in his excellent book, All the Truth Is Out. But Watergate was an embarrassment for the political press, right? The president was committing crimes basically under their nose. And it really, I think, drove home the point that the role of the political press is actually to kind of dig for this stuff and not just to take politicians at their word. The late Cokie Roberts told the folks at Radiolab that one of the other things that's happening here is that there are more women journalists who are staffed on the presidential campaign beat. And a number of them may have actually felt like they were targeted by some of Hart's advances, and as a result, been a little bit more prone or have the tendency to think that that type of information should be disseminated to the public. Technology is changing too, right? Satellite technology, lighter weight cameras and recorders meant that those reporters could get their stories out there fast. And I think, you know, one of the key things that happens is that what Hart got came at him really fast. And so the speed of the ability to report, I think, definitely helps usher in this idea that news is always on and that there's a 24-hour news cycle. One of the other things I think that's really important about the media here is the relationship that's changing between politicians and the press. Hart himself had created an adversarial relationship with the press. He was aloof, he didn't really do campaign briefings, he refused to pose for those staged portraits, and in general, he treated the media sort of with disdain. And you know, that attitude seems relatively common now, right? Nixon did it to really dismissed the media. Trump does it constantly. But in the past, prior to kind of the Nixon era, there were really close relationships between political reporters and politicians. And actually, during one of the marital separations that Hart endured while he was in Washington, he actually slept on reporter Bob Woodward's couch. Oh. So, you know, as this shift to really digging into the personal lives of politicians happens, I think it also drives a rift between politicians and the political reporters that had spent their careers studying or reporting on them. But I think we also, and this is very different from what Eric pointed to with the George Washington case, we see the mainstream media as character assassins. That the Miami Herald created this sensationalism that drove ratings, sort of blew up in the news, what we would call today sort of clickbait, right? And the staking out of Hart's townhouse may have seemed extreme in the 1980s, but I think those types of reporting tactics of doing what you got to do to get the story and to really dig below the surface are a hallmark of political journalism today. And this shift has really stuck with us, that the job and the role of the media is to dig for character flaws related to judgment. And that one place where you can find those is in looking at candidates' personal lives. Now, obviously, this all speeds up even more in the age of social media. There's infinite ways now to disseminate a message, whether it's posting it to a partisan website or finding the fragmented part of the public that, as Eric mentioned, would be more likely to be swayed by evidence of a particular shortcoming of a candidate. So, you know, if it really happens mainstream with Gary Hart, the sort of fragmentation and increased dissemination is something that happens thereafter. And the idea that with all of these different ways to spread messages today, it doesn't have to be the mainstream media, right? It can be an ex-girlfriend from 10 years ago that has a story that can be spread on social media. Yeah. So I think to kind of, again, pull this all together, the changing media environment and the norms of political coverage are definitely at play with the Gary Hart case. And I think they're one reason why the case remains important. And for someone like me who studies character attacks from an academic perspective, I think it means it's important for us to look into things like media audience, but also the general media context and media environment when we study character attacks in our political environment today.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David.
Hugo, speaking earlier, you brought up something very interesting and important, a trend about Republican presidents and presidential candidates in which they're often labeled as dumb, lazy, some variation thereof. Wondering if you could please expound on that, some of the tradition of it, and how you see this fitting into the broader tradition of character assassination in American politics.
Yeah, look, I would go along with the panelists. It's very obvious to everybody that character assassination is now the basic currency of political debate. Just to take, President Trump, he comes up with these slighting nicknames, for example, Sleepy Joe or Slow Joe, Crooked Hillary, Crying Chuck Schumer. And it's just as poisonous on the other side. Joe Biden told black voters that Trump would put them back in chains, which is an extraordinary suggestion. Democrats depicted Brett Kavanaugh as a rapist without a shred of plausible evidence. The usual dichotomy, to come to your point about stupidity, is between stupidity and evil, i.e., the basic way, it seems to me, and you see this all over Twitter, all over social media, all over political debate, is to suggest that someone is either stupid or they're evil, i.e., you're saying that they are a fool or a knave, sometimes both. And the thing that I wanted to focus on here, to go directly to your question, is that the accusation of stupidity that is generally has become the norm for the in this country, the Democrats to accuse the Republicans of being stupid, and to go back and have a look at pretty much where that is regarded as having begun. And that was in England in the middle of the 19th century, when John Stuart Mill referred to the Conservative Party there as the stupid party. It's become the standard accusation. And to go to, just during my lifetime, every Republican president, nearly every Republican president, has been accused in one way or another, with different formulations, of being stupid. Eisenhower, the president at the time when I was born, was regarded and referred to as a sort of sleepy golfing dotard, that he was just asleep at the wheel and he just wanted to play golf. People didn't accuse Nixon of being stupid. He was the knave, the evil. They went to that. But then immediately after him, Gerald Ford was the dolt who couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time. Then Reagan, because he was at that time, I think, one of the oldest people to run for president, indeed to become president, was regarded as treated as a geezer too dim to attend to any details. He was also regarded as dangerous and evil, but the stupidity accusation was a constant. After him, George H.W. Bush came into power. And you remember at the Democratic convention, before he was even in power, he was referred to as having been born with a silver foot in his mouth. In other words, his stupidity was that he couldn't speak properly. He was this rich guy, old patrician family, but it wasn't just that he was an old patrician, it was that he was too dim to talk properly. And then finally, before getting to Trump, George W. Bush, I remember he was constantly being referred to as stupid. And I know people who worked in his administration who say he wasn't nearly as genial and he wasn't nearly as stupid as the public perception and the accusations were suggesting. And I remember one accusation was, I remember seeing a poster, I think it was moveon.org, said, George Bush, like a rock, only dumber. No. And so it's just been, as I say, throughout my entire life, there's hardly a Republican president who has not been accused of being stupid by Democrats and the left.
Now, all those individuals you just mentioned actually won the presidency, and in many cases were reelected. So it begs the question, why do you think Democratic opponents continue to use this tactic when it seems to have, you might say, limited utility?
Well, as was said before, it does give ammo. You can create doubts. I think that in each of these cases, the accusation of stupidity got some traction. But you're right, it doesn't work. And that goes to what I think are the ideological reasons why stupidity is a standard accusation against the conservative or the more conservative candidate. Conservatism started in the 18th century in England, and it was a reaction against liberalism. Liberalism pushes rapid change, and conservatism very deliberately began as a movement to slow that change down and to limit it. You'll remember, and this is sort of classic kind of godfather of conservatism, Edmund Burke, repeatedly made the argument for evolutionary rather than revolutionary change. He believed and conservatism, and he started a movement of conservatism which believes that we owe, as a culture and as a civilization, a debt to the past and not just to the future, and which regards politics as a negotiation between a respected past and the needs of the present and the future. So to some extent, it doesn't work as an accusation, because as actually Irving Kristol wrote in the middle of the 1970s, what conservatism has is treated by the public, or regarded by the public, as a necessary stupidity. In any liberal democracy, you'll have forces of change and forces of preservation. All political debate is essentially about the pace of change. So it's almost a natural law that about half the population are going to be those who think, wait a minute, I don't want things to change so fast. I kind of like the way things are being done. They don't think of it as actual stupidity, but as a kind of humane prejudice in favor of traditional ways. And you don't need the new ideas, the sort of new imaginings to say, I actually kind of like the way things are. You don't have to come up with a new idea because you like the old ideas. And the lack of not coming up with the new ideas is one of those things that, allows the left to say, look at the right, look at conservatives. They're so stupid. They have no new ideas. And it isn't really stupidity, but that's the way you use what conservatism is as an ideology. As an accusation, you turn it to stupidity to demean them and to assassinate their character.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. We could go on and on about all of these subjects, but I want to invite everybody to please join us for the next webinar on character assassination in politics and how it relates to the 2020 election. It will focus on gender-based attacks in politics, with a date and details to be announced soon. So please watch the Twitter accounts of the Washington Examiner and CARP for details. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you.